Okay, good evening, everyone. We are very happy to have our first speaker for 2023, Professor Mahmoud Al Shara'ah, and our moderator for today's event is Dr. Yousef Awad and Dr. Yousef Abu Amrieh. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dina. And first of all, I would like to thank Apitow for organizing this wonderful series. I think it is so important and so informative. I'm also pleased to have to see our colleagues from different universities in Jordan and even from other Arab countries. Welcome all to this session. I am pleased to introduce our speaker this evening. Honestly, one of the best scholars on Shakespeare and the interpretation and reading of Shakespeare within the Arab context. Professor Mahmoud Al Shara'ah is a well-known professor not only in Jordan but also in other Arab countries, since he taught in different Arab countries like Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and he taught also at different universities here in Jordan, including Al Yarmouk University, and then he joined the University of Jordan in 2013. As a colleague, Professor Mahmoud Al Shara'ah is a real scholar and a specialist on Shakespeare and on Shakespeare's representation of the Arab world and how Shakespeare is appropriated and adapted in the Arab world. Professor Shara'ah published many articles in prestigious journals like a critical survey on adaptation and appropriation of Shakespeare in Arabic and in the Arab world. And one of the most important scholars in this field, Margaret Letwin, who is a professor of Shakespeare studies at the University of Boston, cited him in her monograph, Hamlet's Journey in the Arab World. Without much ado, I would like to introduce Professor Mahmoud Al Shara'ah and ask him to start his talk. Professor Mahmoud, you've got around 30 minutes, and then it will be followed by a Q&A. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor Abu Amrieh, for this beautiful introduction, which I probably do not deserve. Thank you very much indeed. And I would like to thank Professor Dr. Hamdan for this, and of course his team for organizing this meeting today, and all the other colleagues who are joining today. Thank you indeed. The title of my talk will be Shakespeare and the Arabs Cross-Cultural Encounters. As you know, Shakespeare has been molded, recycled, revamped, and variously interpreted since the 17th century to the present. His plays in particular have been rendered, adapted, and appropriated into all sorts of media venues, such as drama, opera, music, performance, and cinema. Indeed, the panegyric words of Shakespeare's fellow countryman and friend Ben Jonson express a prophecy that has come true. Eulogizing Shakespeare in his poem, the poem is "To the memory of my beloved author, Mr. William Shakespeare," Ben Jonson says, quote, "Triumph, my Britain, thou hast one to show, to whom all seas of Europe homage owe. He was not of an age, but for all times." This topic in particular has two sides or two aspects. One, dealing with the appropriation and the adaptation of Shakespeare's works into Arabic literature and culture. This subject has been adequately explored by many scholars. For example, Margaret Letwin, Catherine Henze, Mahmoud Al Shara'ah, Yousef Awad, Hussein Hawamda, and many others. I will probably, if I have time, will briefly comment or highlight some of these things. The second topic, which is going to be the main focus of this speech today, it deals with the appropriation of Arabic and Oriental materials in Shakespeare. I will try to explore the treatment of these matters in Shakespeare's works. The story of rewriting and interpreting Shakespeare throughout time have been meticulously investigated and adequately documented. There is a large corpus of criticism and scholarship to this effect. Of particular interest is the reception of the bard in post-colonial drama and world literature at large. Again, as I said, this subject has been fairly considered and analyzed. And I mentioned in my course different studies as well as in many articles written by Professor Amrieh and other colleagues. Let me come to the, yes. I'm going to set my discussion within the context of Elizabethan Orientalism. Many critics and scholars have investigated the representation of the Orient, its peoples and cultures in English literature in almost all literary periods. The English Renaissance period in particular has been carefully explored from this perspective in an attempt to comment on its Oriental matters. A large corpus of criticism dealing with aspects of Elizabethan Orientalism has been produced in the context of the tension between the Ottomans and the West, Islamophobia, and the bitter memories of the Crusades. Drawing on the very treatments of the Orient in English literary studies, I will attempt to explore Shakespeare's representation of the Orient in his oeuvre. Shakespeare reflects in his drama and poetry the vibrant spirit of his age and exposes the common culture of Renaissance England, which historically inherited medieval Europe and its view of the world, especially Islam and the Arab world. For example, when Shakespeare portrays the Moor, the Turk, or the Jew, he simply draws on the stereotypical images of these characters in Elizabethan culture. This speech aims to look into Shakespeare's treatment of the Orient, especially the Arab world and Islam, in line with the post-colonial literary theory as postulated by Edward Said's theory of Orientalism. Shakespeare appropriates in his drama and poetry a relatively large body of Arabic and Islamic materials, which he has gleaned from different sources, such as travel literature, tales of pilgrims, history annals, and narratives of the Crusades. However, none of Shakespeare's plays or poems is completely devoted to the treatment of Arabic themes or Oriental subjects. The Arabic Islamic materials are sporadically woven into his works. In treating the Orient in his drama and poetry, Shakespeare subscribes to the common culture of Renaissance England, which inherited medieval Europe and its view of Islam. However, unlike Elizabethan playwrights who misrepresent the Orient and Islam on the London stage, Shakespeare's treatment of this subject is rather ambivalent. It lacks the flagrant racial prejudice and religious bigotry characteristic of his contemporary fellow drama playwrights such as Marlowe. I will in fact attempt in this speech to examine the corpus of references and allusions to the Arab Islamic world and culture in Shakespeare's drama and poetry, and comment on Shakespeare's depiction of the Oriental character in the context of these references and allusions. The sporadic references and allusions to the Orient in Shakespeare's works are contextually rooted in the bitter memories of the Moorish conquest of Spain, the medieval heritage of the Crusades, and the fear of the Ottoman Empire that was flanking Europe from the east. Shakespeare alludes to Arabia, that's the Arabian Peninsula, several times in his plays. Although these allusions are marginal, they still indicate that the bard was familiar with the common attitude of his age toward the Arab world and culture. For example, Shakespeare refers to Arabia as a desert place in two plays. In the March to Venice, the Prince of Morocco, who obviously comes from North Africa, desires to possess the precious, I'm quoting here from the play, he desires to possess the precious prize that is Portia more than anything else, pointing out that that he is not alone in this quest. He says, the Hyrcanian deserts and the vast wilds of wide Arabia are as thoroughfares now for princes to come view fair Portia. Arabia is mentioned casually in the speech, but the reference clearly shows that Shakespeare and probably his Elizabethan audience imagine Arabia as a wilderness and a desert, wide and vast. In Coriolanus, Shakespeare also refers to Arabia as a desert. Coriolanus' mother, Volumnia, rails against tribunes, saying, I would my son were in Arabia, and thy tribe before him his good sword in his hand. In this context, Arabia figures in the mind of Shakespeare as the land of the sword. Of the word tribe serves to corroborate the stereotypical concept that Arabia was mostly inhabited by nomadic tribes who moved across the desert where the sword is the only form of law. However, in Antony and Cleopatra, Shakespeare suggests that Arabia is a kingdom. Octavius Caesar informs his sister that Antony, her husband, is not in Athens as she assumed, but has given up the empire for the sake of a whore, quote, as he puts it, that is Cleopatra, whom he believes has been drumming up the support of other rulers, including King Manchus of Arabia. We do not know the identity of this Arabian monarch or what part of Arabia Caesar has in mind. The king could be from rocky Arabia in view of the fact that Caesar mentions him along with Herod of Jewry. Therefore, it is likely that Arabia in this context refers to the land lying north of Arabia proper, a country that had in ancient times a great civilization, best exemplified in the ruins of Petra today. Thus, Shakespeare conjures up in the minds of his audience an exotic picture of Arabia, far-fetched and bizarre. Shakespeare alienates Arabia in other ways than those that have been explained. For example, in Lady Macbeth's distracted mind, Arabia is associated with perfumes and incense. She says, here is the smell of blood still. All the perfumes of Arabia will not sweeten this little hand, end of quote. Historically, Arabia was known for its perfumes and incense through the Renaissance, and it is in this capacity that Arabia has been portrayed in English literature. For instance, in a lost play entitled The Phoenix and Her Flames, around 1639, perhaps the only Elizabethan play ever set in Arabia, an Arab princess smothers herself in perfumes and incense until she dies in mourning for the death of her lover. Incidentally, Alexander Pope uses Arabia to the same effect in The Rape of the Lock. Belinda's dressing table includes, among other things, perfumes from Arabia. She quote, and all Arabia breathes from yonder box, end of quote. This notion of Arabia was probably enhanced in Shakespeare's time by English merchants who traded with the Levant. A scrutiny of the works of Shakespeare from this perspective reveals that the dramatist has persistently associated Arabia with the phoenix and a certain Arabian tree. The phoenix is a mythical bird believed to be of Arab origin. In the Riverside Shakespeare anthology, we have this explanation as regards the phoenix. Quote, the phoenix, a favorite emblem for unique perfection, was a creation of classical mythology. Born in the Arabian desert, only a single phoenix existed at any one time. It lived between 500 and 600 years, and when its cycle was completed, burned itself to death atop a fire of aromatic wood twigs, which once ignited by the sun, was kept blazing by the beating of the phoenix's wings. Out of the ashes emerged a new phoenix, self-generated, end of quote. Accordingly, the phoenix has been used diversely in Shakespeare to embody these attributes. It's a native bird of Arabia. It is associated with incense and perfumes of Arabia. It stands for beauty and uniqueness, and it is an item of rarity. In The Tempest, the shipwrecked sailors are completely amazed by the strange happenings on this enchanted island. Quote, Alonso, give us kind keepers, heavens, what were these? Sebastian, a living drollery. Now I will believe that there are unicorns, that in Arabia there is one tree, the phoenix throne, one phoenix at this hour reigning there. By associating the phoenix with Arabia, Shakespeare creates an exotic picture of Arabia, which is completely at variance with the mundane world of his audience. Through Sebastian's remarks on the strangeness of the scene these sailors have witnessed, Shakespeare discloses his familiarity with tales of foreign lands, such as Arabia, that were quite popular in travel literature in his time. Obviously, Shakespeare has repeatedly used some such tale in his drama and poetry, namely that of the legendary phoenix. Shakespeare also used the phoenix in two other plays to suggest the rarity of uniqueness of a particular situation or person. In Antony and Cleopatra, Agrippa and Enobarbus ridicule Lepidus, mimicking his praise for both Caesar and Antony. Quote, Enobarbus, speak thou of Caesar, how the nonpareil Agrippa, oh Antony, oh thou Arabian bird, end of quote. What is interesting here is that Antony is associated with the Arabian bird. That is, he is rare and unique, like the phoenix. However, Antony is implicitly associated with Egypt. Notice that the phoenix is sometimes called the Egyptian bird, and with Cleopatra. In Cymbeline, Shakespeare employs the phoenix to the same effect, to suggest the uniqueness of Imogen. Jashimo, who delivers a letter to Imogen, is completely infatuated by the beauty of this lady. In an aside, he says that if this woman bears so great a mind, commensurate with her physical beauty, then she must be as rare as the Arabian bird. In addition to using the myth of the phoenix to suggest rarity or uniqueness, Shakespeare tries to uses the bird to denote an exotic situation that is strange and incredible. The allusions to the phoenix and Arabia enhance the sense of strangeness of a given situation or suggest the uniqueness of a person. Finally,
Professor Mahmoud,
yes,
if you don't mind, can you please adjust the camera position, please, so that we can see you?
it's okay. Is it okay now?
Yeah, that should be all right. Yeah.
Very good. Thank you.
While you are reading, we can see you.
Yeah, all right.
Thank you. And
Finally,
sorry
Shakespeare uses the Arabian bird in his mystical poem, The Phoenix and the Turtle, which is considered to be almost as vague and mysterious as the phoenix itself. The critics have commented on Shakespeare's choice of the phoenix as mate to the turtle dove. Hallett Smith remarks, quote, Shakespeare often refers in his plays to the phoenix, that legendary bird of Arabia, which lived in a nest of spices and perfumes and died in flames only to rise again from its own ashes. The attribute of the bird which recalled it to Shakespeare's mind was its uniqueness. Only one phoenix was ever alive at any particular time. Shakespeare's poem, The Phoenix and Turtle, is unique among the works. There's nothing else like it. The poem is paradoxical and elusive of any specific meaning. Perhaps it alludes to Queen Elizabeth and the Earl of Essex, especially in view of the fact that the Queen has been symbolically associated with the phoenix in King Henry VIII. At the end of this play, Grandma Duke of Knox blesses the newborn baby who is to become Queen Elizabeth, calling her, quote, the maiden phoenix. Moreover, the phoenix is always mentioned in association with a certain tree, the phoenix throne. In the Tempest, there is one tree, the phoenix throne, and also in the Phoenix and the Turtle, on the sole Arabian tree. Both references point out the uniqueness of the tree as well as the bird. Thematically, the phoenix and the Arabian tree, one sole tree, match. Both connote the same meaning, a unique and far-fetched object that is characteristically Oriental. Again, in Othello, Shakespeare used the Arabian tree to associate his hero with the Orient. Othello's, quote, subdued eyes dropped tears as fast as the Arabian trees, their medicinal gum, end of quote. The identity of the trees has been the subject of speculative research. Different propositions have been made, but critics generally tend to identify them with myrrh, M-Y-R-R-H, myrrh, a tree that naturally grows in the southern regions of Arabia, especially Yemen. In summer, this tree, myrrh, sheds gum, which is used by local people for medical treatment. Shakespeare associates Othello with Arabic background, hence Arabian trees, in order to isolate him from his new European environment. Perhaps Shakespeare used the Arabian tree for the same purpose of adopting other Arabic methods in the play, to identify Othello as the other whose temperament and cast of mind belong to the Arab world. Although Shakespeare uses Arabia in his drama and poetry, he does not set any of his plays in Arabia. On the whole, the playwright sets most of his plays in Europe. However, some do take place in the Eastern Mediterranean, plays in Europe, and the Levant. For example, Pericles takes place in different locations along the Syrian coast, such as Tyre, Tarsus, Antioch, as well as Ephesus and Greece. It is in this context that the setting of the marriage to Venice, Othello and the Tempest, and Antony and Cleopatra should be approached. These plays share one thing in common. They have Oriental backgrounds in terms of place and culture. In the marriage to Venice, Shakespeare alludes to the Arab world through the Prince of Morocco. For instance, the Moroccan prince apologizes for having dark skin, saying in effect that has been caused by the warm climate of his native land. But then he foolishly brags that the virgins of his country worship his color, which Portia would probably reject outright. In Othello, Shakespeare also creates an exotic native setting for Othello, contrasting it sharply with Venice. Although the action of the play takes place in Venice and then in Cyprus, Shakespeare reminds his audience of the Oriental world of Othello, which he really belongs, which he really belongs. Othello's world is also suggested in Antony and Cleopatra, which takes place alternatively in Egypt and Rome and other places. This play has been much discussed, especially in relation to Shakespeare's depiction of Cleopatra and ancient Egypt. Generally, critics point that Shakespeare has shown in this play a dichotomy of the ancient world, Rome or the West, versus Egypt or the East. Peter J. Smith writes, quote, "The conflict dramatized in Antony and Cleopatra is partly expressed through the contrast which Shakespeare establishes immediately between the flowing feminine world of Egypt and the masculine structured world of Rome." End of quote. Shakespeare depicts Egypt as an exotic world ready to be invaded and repossessed by the West. Antony and Cleopatra, like Othello, is clearly associated with a set of stereotypical misconceptions about Egypt, such as witchcraft, sensuality, the serpent, and magic. The audience is introduced to ancient Egypt. For example, Antony explains to Caesar all he knows about that remote country and the importance of the Nile to the fertility of Egypt. Shakespeare's knowledge of Egypt is not always accurate, though, and must have been drawn from his sources of the play and travel books he was familiar with. For instance, it is commonly accepted in Elizabethan drama that the land of Egypt breeds serpents. Shakespeare employs this concept in his play. He associates the serpent with the warm mud of the Nile. Nevertheless, Shakespeare alludes to the Nile and the serpent in Cymbeline. In this interchange between Bassanio and Imogen, Bassanio says, "No, it's slander, whose edge is sharper than the sword, whose tongue outvenoms all the worms of the Nile." In Antony and Cleopatra, as well as in A Midsummer Night's Dream, Cleopatra is specifically depicted as a gypsy with brown-colored skin, suggesting that she has no beauty according to Elizabethan standards. This is a hint at racism. There is a general aversion to dark skin colors in the Shakespeare canon. For example, the Dark Lady of the Sonnets. The Tempest is vaguely set in the Mediterranean. Prosper's enchanted island is probably located between Milan and Tunis. However, Shakespeare is ambivalent about the exact location of the island. In the first place, the bard could have been prompted by the Bermuda's adventures, which were received with so much curiosity and wonder in England. At the same time, he was probably influenced by his own readings of romance about shipwrecks in travel literature. Geoffrey Buller comments, quote, "Topical suggestions might come from America, but for Shakespeare, romance was mainly of the Mediterranean. Not surprisingly, therefore, he combined themes implied by the voyages with similar material in the romance literature, which has influenced his recent comedy." Shakespeare also alludes to Arab cities and countries. For example, Aleppo is used twice in Othello and Macbeth. In both cases, Aleppo is depicted as a commercial center, frequently visited by foreigners. In history, Aleppo was in medieval in major trade post in the Ottoman Empire, and it was often used in this capacity in medieval English literature, such as Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales. In his final speech, Othello mentioned that he has once in Aleppo, where he sided with a Venetian against a Muslim Turk. Shakespeare also refers to Aleppo and Macbeth, the three witches who meet at the outset of the play. Awaiting Macbeth mention Aleppo and even name the ship, the Tiger, which used to sail to the Levant in Shakespeare's time. In both cases, Aleppo is depicted as an exotic place, far-fetched and strange. It is a Muslim city shown to be lacking tolerance towards foreigners. Moreover, it is associated with the witches who represent evil and the supernatural. Shakespeare also alludes to Tripoli, Damascus, Syria, Mesopotamia, the Nile, the Euphrates, and a host of other sites in the Arab world. The Holy Land, Jerusalem, and Palestine has been significantly treated in Renaissance literature. Shakespeare is no exception. The bard alludes to Jerusalem, the Holy Land, and Palestine in its place, especially the histories. For example, in Richard II, Bolingbroke looks forward to taking a pilgrimage to the Holy Land to expiate the blood on his hands. Having ordered the murder of King Richard, Bolingbroke feels guilty, or perhaps he pretends that he is in remorse. He tells the murderer that although he wishes to see the king dead, he hates his murderer. Then he orders everybody to mourn for the dead king, saying in effect that he will now go on a pilgrimage to the Holy Land. Quote, I'll make a voyage to the Holy Land to wash this blood off from my guilty hand, end quote. In any case, the self-appointed King Henry IV, is not given an opportunity to fulfill his religious desire, for troubles break out in various parts of the country in defiance of his authority. These events form the background of the two parts of Henry IV, in which Shakespeare shows that Bolingbroke has to pay dearly for usurping the throne and murdering the rightful, if feminine, King Richard II. No wonder then that the first part of Henry IV begins with the subject of the Holy Land still alive in the mind of King Henry IV, though this time for other reasons, not just to expiate his sins, but also for political exigencies, namely to chase, quote, the pagans, that is Muslims, from the Holy Land, and to engage busy minds at home with foreign wars. In part one of Henry IV, King Henry IV, having subdued his enemies and quelled rebellions against him, announces that he will lead a crusade to Palestine, intended, quote, to chase these pagans in those holy fields over whose acres walked those blessed feet, which 1400 years ago were nailed for our advantage on the bitter cross. The king's speech is charged with religious sentiments, reminiscent of medieval romances and crusades propaganda. The sepulchre of Christ, blessed cross, the holy fields, blessed feet, nailed, and other expressions. Perhaps the king wants to be associated with King Richard the Lion-Hearted, famous for his heroic encounters with Salah ad-Din. However, the king's proposition does not materialize. Having heard that Hotspur has arrogantly challenged his authority, the king finds it impossible to pursue his crusade. Hence, his holy purpose is completely defeated. As he says, as for this cause, a while we must neglect our holy purpose to Jerusalem. The desire to be somehow associated with the recapture of Jerusalem never abates in the heart of King Henry IV throughout the second part of Henry IV. In this play, Shakespeare portrays England in a state of chaos, torn between civil wars and bloodshed. But the Holy Land is never absent from the mind of the king. Despite the king's worries about the outcome of the battles with his enemies, he still hopes to lead his much-delayed crusade to the Holy Land. Conversing with his lords about the troubles in his kingdom, the king, now sick and exhausted from lack of sleep, says, I will take your counsel, and were these inward wars once out of land, we would hear lords unto the Holy Land. Towards the end of the play, particularly in the scene in which he privately receives his son, Prince Hal, in his bedchamber, the dying king forgives his son and gives him a good piece of advice. He tells him that to divert troubles at home, he has all along intended to lead a campaign to the Holy Land. He says, quote, which to avoid, I cut them off and had a purpose now to lead out many to the Holy Land, lest rest and lying still might make them look too near unto my state. The king wants to be emotionally associated with the Holy Land and the memories of the Crusades. He even calls his bedroom where he sleeps Jerusalem. And eventually he dies in the same room in fulfillment of a prophecy to the effect that he would die in Jerusalem. Shakespeare mentions Jerusalem in different contexts several times in the first part of King Henry VI, as well as in part 3, etc. Shakespeare uses Jerusalem once again in King John. There is another reference to Palestine and the Crusades in the same play. King Philip of France reminds Arthur of his great ancestors. Palestine is also mentioned, in fact, in Othello and in many other plays. I don't want to take much time, but I will try to shorten my lecture. The image of Islam in Elizabethan drama is deeply rooted in the long history of belligerence towards Islam in the Middle Ages. Elizabethan dramatists, including Shakespeare, employed anti-Islamic polemics and disseminated a distorted image of Muhammad, the Prophet of Islam, in view of the conflict with the Ottoman Empire, which at the time was posing a living threat to the security of Europe and the existence of Christendom. Being aware of the Muslim power in the East and having inherited a stock of anti-Islamic polemics from the Middle Ages, Elizabethan playwrights propagated stereotypical notions about the Prophet and misrepresented Muslims on the London stage. Elizabethan playwrights have virulently attacked Islam. For example, Marlowe in Tamburlaine attacks Muhammad as follows: quote, "Now, Muhammad, if thou have any power, come down thyself and work a miracle. Thou art not worthy to be worshipped, that suffers flame of fire to burn the writ, wherein the sum of thy religion rests." Marlowe subscribes to false medieval legends which represent Muhammad as a god worshipped by his followers. What is Shakespeare's position toward Islam? How does he depict the Prophet? Surprisingly, Shakespeare does not devote any of his plays to attacking the Prophet or Islam. The casual allusion to Muhammad is drawn from the stereotypical stock of anti-Islamic discourse that England inherited from the Middle Ages. Shakespeare mentions Muhammad by name only once, in part 1 of Henry VI. Charles the Dolphin, King of France, compares John, so-called the Joan of Arc, with Muhammad as follows: "While Muhammad inspired with a dove, thou with an eagle art inspired then." In this instance, Shakespeare uses a false medieval legend about Muhammad to the effect that the Prophet deceived his followers into believing that he received the Holy Ghost by a dove which he had trained to eat grains at his ear. The comparison here is between Joan of Arc, a self-proclaimed prophetess who inspired the French to eject the English soldiers from her homeland, and Prophet Muhammad. Shakespeare used Muhammad in the context of his reputed militancy. That is, if Muhammad spread his religion by the sword, though he was inspired by a dove, that's a false prophet, then Joan should be more militant, for she must have been inspired by an eagle. The image is to indicate Joan's militancy. Implicitly, however, it suggests that Islam is the religion of the sword. And Shakespeare calls the followers of Muhammad Saracens and pagans and Turks. In using these terms, the bard draws on a medieval legacy that depicts Muslims as enemies of Christianity. It is in this sense that the Bishop of Carlisle and Richard II uses these references when he defends Norfolk. Many a time hath banished Norfolk fought for Jesus Christ in glorious Christian field, streaming the ensign of the Christian cross against black pagans, Turks, and Saracens. End of quote. Shakespeare valorizes Norfolk by reminding the audience of his militant role in the crusades launched against Islam, the religion of the Saracens and other Oriental people. Incidentally, Shakespeare does not use the word Arab anywhere in his canon, but he clearly used the word Saracen to refer to the Arab race. In medieval literature, Saracens in particular refer to the followers of Muhammad, that is Arabs, in the sense that they are the enemies of Christ. The only, in fact, Arab character is the Moor, the Prince of Morocco, is distinguished from the other Moors in Shakespeare's canon in the sense that his native land is given. Morocco, that is, he comes from the Berber states in the North Africa. In other words, the Prince of Morocco is instantly recognized as an Arab, and Shakespeare has endowed him with traits that are commonly ascribed to Arabs in terms of physical appearance, details of costume, and cultural mannerism. The Prince of Morocco, who is also used as a title for his race, appears briefly in the play, only in 2 scenes, by the way. As soon as the Prince of Morocco enters, the audience immediately observes his otherness in skin and costume. The text describes the Prince of Morocco as tawny. He is tawny, dark skin. He is dressed all in white. Critics have speculated about what exactly Shakespeare means by tawny. Does it mean dark, olive type, or black, coal black, or perhaps mulatto? The Prince of Morocco is not black, but dark skin, the color of Berbers and Arabs who inhabit North Africa. Othello is notably depicted as an Arab from the Berber states, probably Mauritania. Then at the end of the play, in fact, he was to go back to Mauritania. In respect of religion, therefore, he is akin to the Prince of Morocco. Norman Sanders, one of the critics, believes that Othello should be an Arab because all racial epithets given to him refer to the Arab race. For the modern reader, all of these indications of color and race would always certainly point to a Negro, but for the 17th century Londoner, they could apply equally well to an Arab. End of quote. Othello abides with allusions to the Arab world. For example, the handkerchief is chiefly associated with Egypt, a country that was associated in the mind of Shakespeare and his audience with magic and witchcraft. For instance, Shakespeare draws up an exotic picture of Egypt in Antony and Cleopatra, in which the Egyptian queen is depicted as a sorceress using magic to seduce Antony and enthrall him to her lust. Othello tells Desdemona about the magical power of the handkerchief, relating it to Egypt as follows, quote, "That handkerchief did an Egyptian to my mother give, she was a charmer," end of quote. In addition, Othello is accused of using witchcraft to bewitch Desdemona. This is the opinion of her father and Othello's detractors. They refuse to believe that Desdemona could be accepting Othello as a husband in her right mind, and they therefore argue that she must have been subjected to Othello's black magic. The presence of the handkerchief in Othello, especially used as a token of love and betrayal, gears the minds of the audience to imagining the East as an exotic place at odds with the norms of the civilized world of Venice. I think Shakespeare's, let me just come to the last paragraph. Yeah. Shakespeare's spectrum of Orientalism is succinctly summed up in Othello's final speech, which he delivers shortly before his death. Yes. Shakespeare brings into focus his treatment of the Orient, not only in Othello, but also almost in his entire oeuvre. The Moor, that's Othello, Muslim culture, turban and circumcised, Arabic matters, Arabian trees, Aleppo, perhaps the Jewish theme, the controversy of Judean or Indian. The Moor is Othello, a mercenary in the employment of Venice to fight its enemy, the Muslim Turk, who is contemptuously called circumcised dog. Shakespeare also draws up an exotic image of the Arab East. The place is Aleppo, which was a major trade center in the Levant that counterparts Venice in Europe. As such, Aleppo must have been visited by foreigners, merchants, travelers from the Occident as well. The Venetian beaten by the Turk could be a merchant or a traveler, and the situation clearly shows the animosity between the Muslim Turk and Christian Europeans. Othello has sided with the Venetian perhaps because he converted to Christianity at the time. Ironically, Othello's phrase, circumcised dog, describes Othello himself. By inference, Othello was probably a Muslim, hence circumcised, before his baptism. Othello identifies himself with a circumcised dog, whom he stabbed. Now he stabs himself the same way he smote that Turk into who traduced the Venetian state. Now, this is in fact an overview of the treatment of Shakespeare's, Arabic, the Arab world and Islamic culture in his drama. However, in fact, when we talk about cross-cultural encounters, in fact, there are two sides here. As I said, one side is in fact to look at or highlight the reception of Shakespeare in the Arab world. As I said, in fact, this subject in particular has been adequately explored by many scholars, including as Professor Amrieh is one of them, and Dr. Hussein Hawamda, Margaret Litton, and many others. Just to have a very short, very comment on this kind of treatment.
Yes, sure.
I just look at how Arab poets in particular received William Shakespeare. In fact, major Arab poets, including Ahmad Shawqi, Aziz Ababa, and many others, wrote panegyric, or they praised Shakespeare in many of their poems. They also, some of them, in fact, were inspired or appropriated some of his, poems into their poetry. One of them, in fact, is Abbas Mahmoud Al Aqad. As you know, he wrote a very 46-line dedicatory poem entitled Shakespeare, praising William Shakespeare. He tried to render them into English as some of the lines as follows. The following is a rendition of some lines. You are the father of poetry, a miracle of speech for Arabs and non-Arabs. You make legends alive and real so that we think they are created by God, not by fancy. Now, the last line probably echoes Hazlitt, as Al-Aqad has just acknowledged in a footnote to the poem. What is actually interesting is that, Al-Aqad appropriated Shakespeare's poem Venus and Adonis, Adonis. Shakespeare's Venus and Adonis has been treated poetically by Al-Aqad, whose poem Venus ala juthati Adonis, could be something like Venus at the corpse of Adonis, is a redaction of Shakespeare's poem written in line with Arabic elegiac poetry. The poem relates to Shakespeare's in two ways. First, it is about Venus and Adonis in some sort. The poet summarizes in a lengthy note the myth of Venus and Adonis as used in Ovid and William Shakespeare, and indicates that his poem is an Arabicized version of Shakespeare's. Second, the theme of the poem, that is Venus' love to Adonis, is based on Shakespeare's poem. However, while Shakespeare's poem is it's more than 1,000 lines, Al-Aqad's poem is only 32 lines. I find also a poet from Sudan. Sudanese poet. In fact, he wrote a short poem, three stanza, in which he tried to appropriate the theme of the Merchant of Venice. As I said the following thing. Shakespeare has influenced Arabic poetry and inspired Arab poets in other ways. For instance, Arab poets have poetically rendered certain speeches or excerpts from the plays and poems into Arabic verses. This sort of literary treatment of Shakespeare is relatively popular in Arab poetry, as will be shown in the different examples that will be discussed in this paper. As a case in point, let us consider the Sudanese poet Mubarak Hassan al-Khalifa. I googled this name. He died in 2014. His poem Awdat Shaylukh, the Return of Shylock, which clearly relates to Shakespeare's The Merchant of Venice and the strange stage image of Shylock in particular in English literature. Consisting of 3 stanzas, the poem draws on the stereotypical image of Shylock as a vindictive, bloodthirsty Jew who is misanthropic by nature. The poem is written in the aftermath of the Six-Day War, in which Israel defeated the Arab countries. The poet sees Shakespeare's Shylock as an epitome of evil and a monster of destructive nature. It should be pointed out that Arab writers have always interpreted Shakespeare's The Merchant of Venice, especially his depiction of Shylock, in the context of the Arab-Israeli conflict. Hence, they believe that Shakespeare has given an evidence of the evil nature of Jews in his play, and that the Jew throughout this time is summed up in the person of Shylock. It is in this context that Ali Ahmed Bakathir from Yemen wrote his 2-part play, Shaylukh al-Jadid, the New Shylock, and it's also the same spirit that Shylock is represented in this poem. The following translation of the first stanza of the poem is evidence of the point I have just made. I quote here, I'm trying to translate this stanza. Have you come back, O Shylock, carrying in your hand the bond to mock the justice of our age? True to the image of the Elizabethan Shylock al-Khalifa, and very much like Bakathir's Shylock, draws up Shylock as a monster who carries a knife in one hand and the bond in the other hand, insisting all the time on his right for the pound of flesh from the living body of Antonio. This is the permanent image of Shylock in Arabic poetry. He is also a usurer and moneylender who devours the poor, taking advantage of their needs, as shown in Mustafa Wahb Tal's poem Ila al-Murabin, to the usurers, in which the poet attacks the usurers in his native Jordan, associating them with Shakespeare's Shylock. Money lenders are brothers of Satan. Oh, Shylock's group, whoever supports you defames or defamates rights, ethics, and religion.
Mhm.
In fact, it's a very long story. I'm sure that, I don't want to take much time, but I would like to leave time for discussion or question. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Professor Mahmoud. Thank you very much on behalf of all the audience here. I think this is a wonderful presentation, so meticulous, so thorough. And what I really like is that you have given us this thorough survey of Shakespeare's representation and the references to the Orient and to Muslims. And then you moved on to the idea of reception and how Shakespeare was received in the Arab world later on. I really thank you for all this, for opening our eyes on ideas and things that probably we were not aware of. Well,
Thank you, Professor. Thank you
yeah.
indeed.
Well, now we will open the floor for discussion. I'm sure that we've got so many questions, comments from.
If you just, Dr. Yousef, just allow me just to read this Othello's last speech. I consider it sums up Shakespeare's the whole idea of Orientalism.
Right.
His Othello, before he actually stabs himself to death, he gives a speech. He says, "Soft you, a word or two before you go. I have done the state some service, and they know it. No more of that. I pray you, in your letters, when you shall these unlucky deeds relate, speak of me as I am, nothing extenuate, nor sit down aught in malice. Then must you speak one that loved not wisely, but too well, one not easily jealous, but being wrought, perplexed in the extreme, one whose hand, like the base Indian," sometimes it's reading Judean, not Indian, Judah Iscariot, "threw a pearl away, richer than all his tribe, one whose subdued eyes, albeit unused to the melting mood, drops tears as fast as the Arabian trees. Their medicinal gum, set you down this, and say perhaps besides that in Aleppo once, where a malignant and a turbaned Turk beat a Venetian and traduced the state, I took by the throat the circumcised dog and smote him thus, and then he kills himself." Thank you.
Thank you very much. What an ending to this presentation. Thank you very
it's
much.
like, this whole speech, in fact, sums up the whole argument of Shakespeare's Orientalism.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, now we open the floor for discussion. If you've got questions, please raise your hands and feel free to ask your questions. Just one point I want probably to add before you think of any questions is that Shakespeare's plays have also triggered recent Arab writers to write back to Shakespeare and to respond to his representation of the East. For instance, Mamdouh Adwan wrote his famous play, Hamlet Wakes Up Late, and even we have a response to that particular play. So we have Zaid Mustafa, who wrote Hamlet a while after, in which he was responding to Mamdouh Adwan, and of course he was belatedly making an allusion to Shakespeare. So Shakespeare is still with us, he's still relevant. Of course, Arab writers in diaspora usually draw on Shakespeare in their novels. Of course, we know that Tayyib Saleh, Season of Migration to the North, is a very good example of writing back to Shakespeare's Othello. And of course, we have so many other authors. And yeah, I'm just wondering if we've got questions from people here. If you've got a question, please raise your hand. You can ask questions on the representation of Arabs and Muslims by Shakespeare. Of course, you can ask about reception. Professor Mahmoud is one of the best scholars on Shakespeare, and I'm here urging our students and ex-students who graduated from our PhD programs to ask questions, because this is a very good opportunity for you to glean ideas probably later on to work on your research in this field. Let us see. Yes.
Can I ask?
Question from Amal Al Khayyat. Please go ahead, Amal.
Yes, Professor.
معلش دكتورة from Dr. Amal Khayyat.
Yes, Dr.
Thank
Amal
you.
Khayyat. Yeah.
Thank
Congratulations
you.
to Dr. Amal
Right.
Khayyat, who graduated last week.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
thank you
Professor
so much.
Mahmoud
Thank
was
you.
on her panel.
Yeah, thank you so much. I would like to start by thanking Professor Mahmoud for the interesting lecture. I really enjoyed it a lot. Professor, my question is,
Amal, the voice is not clear.
the voice is not clear.
Yeah.
Your
What
voice
now?
is,
Is it,
no, it's just
is it,
noisy.
is it
Screeching.
better now?
Yeah,
This
yeah, it's
is-
better now. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's better now. Okay. So, Professor, my question is there a particular play by William Shakespeare that has not been adapted yet, and you personally think or wish that it could be adapted by an Arab author to draw on some contemporary socio-political conditions in the Arab world?
Well, actually, not all of Shakespeare's plays were adapted into Arabic, and I know that I think all of them were translated. Now we could actually collect the translation into
Yes.
what could be called the complete works. The plays which were quite popular for adaptation, King Lear, for instance, the tragedies in particular, Othello, Hamlet, I think more than anything else, and Othello in particular. So I'm sure that Shakespeare is always well received, not only in the Arab world but also elsewhere. In fact, some years ago when I went to India on an academic mission, I met a lady. She was writing a book on Shakespeare in Asia. So we could find Shakespeare, for example, almost in the jungles of Africa.
Of course.
I remember when I was doing my research about Shakespeare, started this more than 15, 20 years ago. I came across an article in Arabic. Somebody was trying to see, to find out how much Shakespeare was quite popular amongst the Arab people. So the interviewer was asking a lady in the grocery market, do you know Hamlet? She responded, we are not to be. So this is a very famous quotation, which is often cited by people, to be or not to be. You can even find it sometimes on the car tires, etc. So I'm sure that Dr. Amal, that depends on the how writers receive Shakespeare. For instance, Professor Amrieh mentioned Mamdouh Adwan, one of his, in fact, early adaptations or appropriations of Hamlet, Hamlet Istaqbal Mutaakhiran, which is a political play in which he tries to emphasize the what one may call the impotency or the weakness of the Arab intellectual. He talks and talks, but in fact he does nothing. I mean, he's unlike the intellectual in Edward Said. The intellectual is supposed to speak truth to power. But for the Arab intellectual, in fact, he actually he's afraid of the authority. This reminds me of the play, Brecht's play, The Mother Kaj and Her Children. There is a song in which, in fact, if you have a case, you have a problem, an issue to make, once you come to the ruler, then you forget everything out of fear. So this is the way it is.
Yes,
I still remember the last, I think the last statement in Mamdouh Adwan's play, we live in the هذا هو الزمن الرديء. This is bad time. It's our times, the zaman al-radiyah. Thank you, Dr. Amal.
Thank you so much, Professor.
Thank you, Dr. Amal. Thank you, Professor Mahmoud. Now we've got a question from Apitao President, Professor Jihad Hamdan. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much indeed. I'd like to thank Professor Mahmoud Al Shara'ah for this excellent presentation. I learned a lot from this presentation.
Thank you, sir.
We tend to say that English is no longer the property of Britain or United Kingdom. Shakespeare, I think, is no longer just the property of Britishers. Shakespeare has become an important, outstanding character and figure for the world. And in the title of your presentation, there is this phrase of cultural encounters. And to me, as a linguist, when we talk about an encounter, we talk about giving and taking. You give and then you take. Would you, in a way, briefly tell us what has Shakespeare given us and what has he taken from us as Turks, as Arabs, you name it? The term is not important.
This is a very good question.
Yes,
it is a very good question indeed, and which is not easy to answer, by the way. And I once came across an article written by a Sudanese it was about the T.S. Eliot. I think the title is, I still remember the title, but I forgot the author. Alama, why are we infatuated with T.S. Eliot, the Arab writers, from Badr Shak al-Siyab all through to al-Bayati and many others. They were quite infatuated in a way by T.S. Eliot. Again, by the same token, we can see also many Arab writers, not only Arab, but worldwide actually. You find, for example, Shakespeare appropriated in North America or in Indian literature, etc. There is so much infatuation. Perhaps, as you just said, that Shakespeare nowadays belongs to the world. It is not a property of, yes, of course, he's English, but he has become actually a human legacy for everybody. You can always find a platform. I think it's from Latin America, when he actually adapted the Tempest. The play The Tempest lends itself easily to the post-colonial theory. He actually finds that the Tempest is indeed addresses the question of colonialism. Caliban in the play writes, he fights back. He says to his master, the magician Prospero, you taught me language, but I use it to curse you. So it is in fact by writing back, by fighting back. You don't actually give up in this sense. Indeed, Shakespeare is used from this post-colonial theory to write back to the center, that is to England, to Shakespeare himself in this sense. So he doesn't belong anymore to England. Of course, he does in terms of nationality, but he's a legacy of humanity.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Professor Mahmoud.
Thank you.
We've got a question from Professor Fawaz Abdul Haq, President of Al-Hashimiyya University. Please, Professor.
Well, thank you. In this talk, I am a student and I'm a disciple to Professor Mahmoud Ishtawi. He is my exemplary model. Thank you very much indeed from the depth of my heart.
Thank you,
Professor. Always inspiring and always leading us to higher and lofty places. And we always say that literature is language use at best. We're just serving literature. Again, it's relevant to the same question said by Professor Dr. Jihad. In linguistics, we talk about linguistic imperialism. And this was demonstrated in a book written by Robert Phillipson. He talked about the imperialism of English, and that guy was kicked from Britain, and he stayed most of his life in I think in Denmark. Back to the same question, instead of saying the representation of Muslims and Moors and Arab in Shakespeare, why this misunderstanding and misrepresentation and abuse and disuse of this clean picture of the Arab? I think, don't we see people that can be just and fair to the Arabs and to the Islamic culture? Yes, we bred Orientalism. What about Occidentalism? Orientalism, as was demonstrated by Edward Said, it's the way of understanding the East in order to dominate the East. They are looking for not only homogenization of people and cultures, they are looking for hegemonization of both culture and people and language. So what implications can we do? As students of language, students of literature and linguistics, the role of Department of English Language scattered all over the Arab countries, what implications can we draw from the studies of Shakespeare and on Shakespeare? Thank you, Professor Abu Haytham.
This is another good question. Actually, should we include Shakespeare in our curriculum? I always want to teach
Yes.
Shakespeare as for an undergraduate course. Ask myself this question. I ask for the students as well. Why should we include Shakespeare in the curriculum? For instance, in America, in the undergraduate, the BA level, Shakespeare is not quite popular anyway. They try to look at human cultural studies more than anything else. So actually, you are right. Of course, I think this has to be thoroughly investigated. Why do we include in the Arab universities Shakespeare in our curriculum? Indeed, well, to my knowledge, my understanding is that Shakespeare, whether we like it or not, is racist. It's very clear, in fact. When, of course, critics may differ on this issue, saying, well, listen, that you read a text, but you don't. The text does not necessarily represent Shakespeare. I mean, if I want to use the Roland Barthes theory, the death of the author, Shakespeare now is dead. In fact, when you look at The Tempest, for example, you may say, but this is the text itself. That's not necessarily Shakespeare. Here, then, there's the ambivalent. Even, by the way, Shakespeare's attitude towards the other is always ambivalent in a way. And when he depicts the Jew, the Shylock in the play, you can read it both ways. In fact, even today in contemporary criticism, they say that Shakespeare is doing justice to Shylock because he gives him the floor. He puts him on this floor to defend himself, to speak out about the grievances, the injustices that have been committed, imposed on him in a way. So if you look at this play from this context, you can say Shakespeare, in fact, stands on kind of a border, and you can interpret him either way. Either he is a racist or that he is not a racist. It's an issue which has not been completely settled. It needs more further studies. Professor Fawaz, as you know, this is my, I think you are a scholar, you know, because in fact, I would like to, in fact, describe you as Edward Said has put it in his book, The Representation of the Intellectual, who speaks truth to power. In fact, you speak truth to power. Thank you very much.
Indeed.
Thank you. Thank
you, Professor Fawaz and Professor Mahmoud. Professor Mahmoud, I have a question for you till we have more questions from other people. And this question is actually based on Professor Fawaz and Professor Jihad's points. I would like to hear from you a kind of evaluation if we want to compare Shakespeare's representation of the Orient and Muslims to his contemporaries, for instance, Marlowe. And if we go a little bit further back, Chaucer. So where would you position Shakespeare vis-a-vis these two important figures, Chaucer and Marlowe?
Yes, this is another good one. In fact, the questions today are very good. In fact, in Samuel Chu's book, The Crescent and the Rose, The Crescent and the Rose by Chu, it was published in 1947, but it's very, very important book. There is a whole chapter entitled Muslims on the London Stage. Now, Shakespeare is not one of them, by the way. Shakespeare was, unlike Marlowe or and many others who were very vehement in attacking or distorting Islam. I think Shakespeare, he has the references to Muslims or Arabs here and in his plays are quite humble in a way. And they were actually inherited from the Middle Ages. And in fact, the image of the Muslims in the Middle Ages, Islam in the Middle Ages, was completely distorted.
Yes.
Which is still, by the way, being distorted even today, in a way. So you need people to remember a few years ago, Geoffrey Nash came to the university, gave, in fact, a lecture, and asked him this question: how come that the Jews were able, in the Middle Ages, for example, in medieval literature, the Jew was considered a child strangler and the poison, well poisoner.
No.
He was completely misrepresented or distorted in a way. However, as we come to the middle of the 18th century, the age we call the Enlightenment, the image of the Jew was completely changed from very, very negative to very, very positive. In fact, even the Merchant of Venice, in which in fact Shakespeare creates the character of Shylock as a misanthropist. However, in Cumberland's play, the Jew, and the Shylock becomes a philanthropist. So this is just the opposite in a way. But they were working very hard to change the image anyway. In our case, I remember years ago, I went to attended a conference in America, I think back in the 80s, and I met a person who was in fact the cultural attaché American in Amman. He invited me to Manhattan and he gave me a tour. And I remember his words. He said, look, wherever you go, you find these Zionists or Jews hammering at our heads, reminding us of the Holocaust. But you guys do not exist. You are not there. We don't see it, in fact. We don't see us there. We are not there, in fact. The only voice which was very strong, very powerful, still resonating in the world is the voice of Edward Said. You know, he was in the midst of the Jewish community in a way.
Yeah, of course.
But he was an outspoken critic of Zionism and of course of the injustices committed upon the Palestinians, Arabs in general. Thank you, Dr.
Thank you very much. If we've got other questions from other people, other questions, Professor Mahmoud is happy to take them. Noor Al-Kilani, another PhD student at the University of Jordan. Go ahead, Noor, please.
Okay, thank you, Professor. Thank you, Professor Mahmoud, for your wonderful presentation. I wanted to ask about, like, we talked about the Arab writers being influenced by Shakespeare. What about Shakespeare himself? Isn't he influenced by Arab culture? Like when he, for example, in the Taming of the Shrew, I mean, he is, I think, influenced by the Arabian Nights. So can we say that he is also influenced by the Arabs and Arab culture in this way? Like the character of Catherine is like the Shrew. It's like the characters in the Arabian Nights of the defiant woman. So can we say this? And thank you.
This is another good question. In fact, to answer the question, I have to comment on Shakespeare's play. Where is it? I hope I will find it now. I think you have a point there. But this needs to be investigated, carefully investigated as to Shakespeare's sources. Nowadays, Shakespeare's sources are all well known. You can find them in the different books in the library. Just bear with me just a minute.
Sure.
Yes, you mentioned the Taming of the Shrew. In fact, one should draw attention to a possible, but this is, by the way, speculative. There is no evidence. There is no hard evidence. It's a matter of speculation. To a possible Oriental source for the Taming of the Shrew, Shakespeare's immediate sources for the play are known, namely a lost play entitled A Shrew and another comedy entitled Supposes, both of which were something to Roman comedy. However, Shakespeare's debt to the Arabian Nights is clearly evident in the induction, which is a redaction of the story of the sleeper awakened in the Arabian Nights. This is rather puzzling because the first translation of the Arabian Nights in any European language appeared in 1704, when Antoine Galland translated the work into French. However, stories of the Arabian Nights were known to Europe as early as the 14th century. You mentioned Chaucer, and appear in different literary works. For instance, the story of the sleeper awakened, which tells the story of a simple Baghdad beggar or merchant who is deceived into believing that he is the Caliph Harun al-Rashid, appears to have been known to Shakespeare in some form or another, and that Shakespeare uses it as a framing device of the Taming of the Shrew. whether Shakespeare looked at the Arabian Nights seems to be rather dubious. And Anne Barton, the critic, points out, quote, "The motif of the beggar who wakes to find himself inexplicably surrounded with wealth and comfort, beyond his wildest imaginings, was popular both in Europe and in the East. It is one of the tales told in the Arabian Nights where the adventure-loving Khalif Harun Rashid engineers the trick. Shakespeare has probably drawn the story of the induction from the Arabian Nights, but he shapes it in a way to suit his dramatic purposes. Abu Hassan of the Arabian Nights is transformed into Christopher Sly, a drinking tinker from the part of England Shakespeare knows best. In the induction, Sly accepts his supposed state, being persuaded that he has been ill and estranged from his folk because of lunacy, and begins to act like a lord. But unlike his Oriental stereotype, the sleeper of the Arabian Nights, Sly fades away as the insect play begins, and he completely slips into oblivion. In the original Arabic tale, the beggar returns to his former state, believing that he has had a wonderful dream. Furthermore, Shakespeare creates in language an Oriental tapestry in the induction. For example, scene 1, Lion's Head, which is quite suggestive of the exotic milieu of the Arabian Nights. The Lord instructs his page to play a rather voluptuous scene and prepare a lustful bed that would belie the legendary queen of Assyria, Semiramis, notorious for her voluptuousness and promiscuity in the Middle Ages. I think this issue as to Shakespeare's sources has to be carefully and investigated to find out. As you know, yes, the Arabian Nights was not completely translated at that time, but probably some of the tales were quite popular in England and elsewhere in Europe. Thank you for a very good question. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Mahmoud. This is a very good point. And since we are on the taming of the shrew, well, it is quite interesting that it was adapted into an Egyptian movie. And
yeah, vernacular.
Yeah, it was Fatma Rushdie. Fatma Rushdie played Catherine or Katrina. So that's a very interesting thing, how literature travels, and in the process it shapes itself and reshapes itself anew. Do we have other questions? Okay.
اسمح لي بس ختاما
تفضل دكتور.
اسمحوا لي اتغزل بحبيبي ابو هيثم، يعني وهو حقيقه وارثنا في الجامعات الاردنيه وفي اقسام اللغه الانجليزيه.
هذا من لطفك يا دكتور.
يعني خمره التجارب في تدريس الادب وشكسبير على تواضعه وعلى اخلاصه للعلم، يعني فعلا يعني يكرم، يستفاد منه في حقل تعليم اللغه الانجليزيه، وهو يعني انا احس بالداخل يعني رسميا قصروا مع هذا الرجل، لكن نحن له محبه في قلوبنا والله، ولذلك
باسمكم انت قريب على القلب يا دكتور فواز. وانا حقيقه انا فخور انا بشتغل، يعني بيقولوا انا سكولر امونج سكولرز، يعني فكل زملائي، وطبعا صاحب الفضل الكبير الدكتور جهاد والذي اتى بي الى الجامعه الاردنيه، وتعرفت على زملاء كبار الدكتور يوسف وعمرية.
دكتور جهاد زعيم العصابه، هي عصابه الابيتاو كلها.
والله انا I'm always grateful صراحه، له مكانه خاصه. دكتور فواز يعني انت لك
حبيبنا ابو هيثم وحبيبنا ابو محمد.
الله يرضى عليكم. يعني احنا يعني اذا تقسمت البلاد العربيه على عشائر فلناخذ عشائر اللغه والادب عشيره، يعني هذه عشيره نلجا اليها والله.
شكرا.
Thank you very much. So, of course, if we've got no questions, please allow me again to thank Professor Mahmoud Al Shara'ah, whom Margaret Litvin referred to in her book as Mahmoud Al Shatawi. And then when I was reading that book, I came to Professor Mahmoud Al Shara'ah and asked him, do you know this guy? Do you know Mahmoud Al Shatawi? He said, that is me. So that was when I first understood who Professor Mahmoud Al Shara'ah is a great Shakespeare scholar. Thank you very much, Professor Mahmoud, for this wonderful talk. And thank you, Professor Jihad, and thank you, Apitao, Dr. Dina, for organizing this. And many thanks to all the participants and to the questions asked by you. And hopefully we will meet you in another talk, inshallah, next month. Thank you very much.
Thank
Can
you
I
all.
say a
Thank you.
word?
Thank you very much.
Can
Over
I
you
say a
indeed.
word, Professor Abu Amrieh, at the end?
Sorry?
Yes, just I want to say a few words
Yeah.
at the end before I give the floor to Dr. Dina to conclude. Yes. Once again, I'd like to thank Professor Mahmoud Al Shara'ah. الشتاوي يعني winter, يعني شتاء. فهو يعني he is with us in winter again. And this is Al-Ghaith from Professor Mahmoud. Thank you, Professor Mahmoud, I'd like to thank him for his being kind and generous to us and with us in Apitao. He's given us part of his time to empower us in literature and in cultural encounters. And just like what I said earlier, we have learned from this rich presentation. He's been shining all through to the very last second and will continue to shine beyond this seminar. I'd like also to thank the intelligent moderator, skillful moderator, Professor Yousef of Amrieh, for this excellent running of the session, leading us all through. And I want to thank my colleagues, Apitao members of the academic forum, Dina topping the list with her colleagues. And I'd like to thank you all, the audience, the participants, those who contributed to us through their questions, through their comments. Special thanks, of course, to my colleague and friend, Professor Fawaz. He's been with us all the time and has been very supportive to Apitao all through. And we are proud of him. Other colleagues, I cannot name all. I cannot name all because of time, not because of anything else. They're equally important, equally valuable to us, and we are proud of them all. Thank you all. Looking forward to meeting you again in the February session. It's coming up very soon. It will be in linguistics. And this is an invitation to Professor Fawaz. Professor Fawaz, a leading linguist, we'd like you to be with us here, giving a presentation. If not in February, in March. You decide when to be with us, but we would like you to be with us all the time. Thank you very much indeed. And I give the floor to my colleague, Dina, to conclude. Thank you. We've been very pleased, very happy with you all. Thank you.
Before I say anything, does Professor Fawaz, would you like to respond or no?
My pleasure. I will, inshallah. I'm coming, hopefully. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Mahmoud, for this enlightening talk. We are very happy to have had you as our first speaker for 2023. Professor Yousef, thank you for moderating so wonderfully. And I'd also like to thank the audience for joining us today. Of course, had it not been for you, this forum would not be as it is. Professor Fawaz, thank you also for joining us today. It's been our honor to have you. I would just like to say, just to reiterate what Professor Jihad just said, we will be preparing for our next event in February. It will be focused on linguistics. And today's lecture, we will hopefully try to upload it as soon as possible on our YouTube page for those who would like to go back and watch it again, or for those who were unable to join us for today's event. Thank you so much.
Thank
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 you.
you, Doctora. Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.